Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Hattie's Child podcast. My name is Steve White, and today we are going to talk about the evolution and the true legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So bear with me as I want to put the timer on because I will always try to respect the amount of time that we spend in the podcast, not to hold you too long. Okay. All right. So let's go. So this is a very important topic in my personal opinion, as an educator, as a member of the Black community, as a historian, if you will. A very important topic for the Black family. It's a very important topic for Black children, something that Black parents can pass on to their children. And why I say it's important is this. Talking about the evolution and the true legacy of Dr. King means that we are going to define Dr. King instead of letting the white controlled media, the white controlled educational system define Dr. King. It means that when we define Dr. King, we're also taking control of the defining of all of our leaders, which is what we are supposed to do. We're not supposed to let someone else define who our leaders are, choose who our leaders are. And so we must define Dr. King in his truth, not the image that somebody else wants to perpetuate about Dr. King because it serves their selfish interests. And I'm going to explain to you what I mean by all of that. But when we define Dr. King, it means that we are defining ourselves, that we are now speaking for ourselves, as opposed to, again, letting a white-controlled media or a white-controlled educational system or the government or anybody else define Dr. King. Because when we have leaders who work hard for the advancement of our race, who literally sacrificed their lives as Dr. King did, we have a divine obligation to honor them, to respect them, to tell the truth about their lives, and to again establish their true legacy. So let's get right into it with the evolution and the true legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to let me go through some phases, and because I just want to bring some people up to speed, because I recognize that there may be people listening who really, believe it or not, don't know a lot about Dr. King other than what they have heard over the years, and a lot of the younger people really don't know a lot about him in truth. So Dr. King came on the scene, as many of us do know, came on the scene really around 1955 when he went into Montgomery, Alabama as a young minister to pastor a church there in Montgomery, Alabama. He became a leader there in the community in Montgomery, Alabama, as the people there were fighting racism and segregation. And Dr. King was a young pastor. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was 29 or maybe even a little younger, but he was in his 20s when he went into pastor the church there in Montgomery, Alabama. And as some of you may know, during that time, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus when Black people had to either sit to the back of the bus or stand so that white folks could sit down. And they led the Montgomery bus boycott, and eventually they were victorious as far as getting the buses integrated, if you will, where Blacks could sit anywhere they wanted to sit on the bus. So, but the Montgomery bus boycott is a lesson that maybe we'll talk about at another time that really needs to be studied for all of the lessons that came out of what happens when Black people unify around a common cause. But we'll have to discuss that later. So Dr. King became a civil rights leader, and he became a well-known civil rights leader, and he led marches and protests in addition to him being a minister. And he became probably the most well-known of all the civil rights leaders during the 50s and then into the early 60s. Well, in 1963, Dr. King and other civil rights leaders led what was called the March on Washington. The March on Washington was, I think it was 100,000 or more Black people converging, and whites for that matter too, some whites as well, converging on Washington, D.C. to protest once again racism, segregation, discrimination, etc., and to advocate for civil rights. At the March on Washington, Dr. King gave what became known as his I Have a Dream speech. That speech has gone on to become one of the most famous speeches, probably in the history of the world, definitely we know in the history of the United States. And it became the speech that is associated with Dr. King. So we know now that usually as we celebrate Dr. King's birthday every year in January, that the I Have a Dream speech is a speech that you always hear excerpts from that speech. And you go to Dr. King events honoring Dr. King around his birthday. And I know here in my hometown, year after year, they would have oratorical contests with the children, and they all were giving some version or variation of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. So that is his signature speech, if you will, according to the media, the educational system, etc. They've associated Dr. King with the I Have a Dream speech. And the reason why so many people, I think, over the years have fallen in love with that speech is because it serves so many different interests of different people with different motives in mind. Because in the I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King talked about the day that would come when Black boys and white girls and Black girls and white boys and everybody would be able to walk hand in hand. And he had this dream that one day, you know, people will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And so people latched on to that speech. And of course, Dr. King was one of the greatest orators of our time. I mean, he always gave a very fiery, emotional, beautiful delivery of his speeches. And so that became, again, as I said, one of the most famous speeches in history, the I Have a Dream speech. The thing about it is that every year when we talk about the I Have a Dream speech, it's almost as if there were no other speeches that Dr. King gave that was of equal significance or maybe even greater significance. And I would suggest to you that he gave some that was of even greater significance. So I want to talk about what I said before is the evolution and the true legacy of Dr. King. And that is that here we had this young civil rights leader, or this young preacher, come into Montgomery, Alabama, and become a great leader. And then we have this great preacher and civil rights leader who gave this monumental speech in 1963 at the March on Washington, which is his historic occasion and a historic speech. But Dr. King didn't stop there. He was assassinated in 1968. So he lived for another 5 years after that speech. And believe it or not, those 5 years were transformational as far as I'm concerned, as far as the life of Dr. King. He was evolving rapidly and tremendously over those next 5 years. So let's talk about that if we really want to understand Dr. King and to give honor to him, honor that he deserves. Dr. King said in later conversations, and I personally heard him in an interview that you can find on YouTube, matter of fact, where Dr. King said that the speech, the I Have a Dream speech over the years had literally become a nightmare. Dr. King was no longer championing the I Have a Dream speech. He no longer had this expectation that people were going to be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. He understood that racism was so embedded in America and the system of white supremacy was so embedded in America that that was a hollow dream that was not going to materialize, not in his lifetime, and as we know now, hasn't materialized in our lifetimes. So Dr. King said, the speech that I gave in 1963, I Have a Dream, that speech has become a nightmare. because I am no longer holding out for this dream to come true. Dr. King also was a realist, a person who really understood the realities of what he was dealing with. And every year, as he continued to evolve, he understood it even more. So Dr. King understood that his people were being pacified by this dream. And he understood that, as the old saying is, nothing comes to a dreamer but a dream. So Dr. King realized that I have evolved, and I want my people to evolve and move forward and understand that, no, we're not holding on to this unrealistic dream, this dream that has indeed become a nightmare. So that's the first thing that's very important for us to understand, that Dr. King was no longer a champion of this idea of a dream, of this colorblind society that he realized now was not going to materialize in his lifetime or in ours. And at that time, Dr. King did not know that he would be assassinated in 1968. He was still a young man. And so he understood that whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or 50 years from now, he had a better grasp of who and what America really, really is. So the dream had become a nightmare, according to Dr. King. The other thing that's very important to talk about in Dr. King's evolution is that Dr. King also talked about the fact that as he was coming into this, I guess what I would call an awakening, if you will, and just becoming more realistic about the challenge that he was facing as he worked hard to help advance our people, was that there were a lot of people that paid lip service to the civil rights movement, but really were not committed to Black people being treated fairly and equally in America. Dr. King said one of the things that he had learned is that what white people did, and of course, we're not indicting every white person, but let's be honest, about what Dr. King said and about our reality. Dr. King said that what he had come to realize was that white people would express concern or outrage oftentimes when an incident was fresh in their minds, but there was no follow-up to really bring about any change. As soon as some of that emotion died down, then the system of white supremacy and white privilege and racism and discrimination all went right back into play as usual. And give you an example of what he meant by that, because that's a very profound lesson that he was teaching there. So what Dr. King was saying is that if you put on television the dogs and being sicked on the Black protesters when they would be marching, and you would show footage of people of the police putting the fire hose, the police and the firemen putting the fire hoses on the Black people, old women, old men, children, etc., dogs being sicked on them, being attacked with the fire hoses simply because they were protesting. What Dr. King said was, yeah, white folks would express sympathy or outrage at the time that they saw those incidents. But once that emotion subsided, they really did not work to bring about any real substantive change, according to Dr. King. A modern day example of that would be when George Floyd was murdered, and he was murdered, it was there in broad daylight, literally for the world to see. A lot of white people said, oh, that's terrible, that's outrageous, that's so sad. I mean, all of the emotional outrage that you could express was being expressed. And so companies said, oh, we're going to do better by our hiring policies and everything because we're so outraged at what happened with George Floyd. Individual whites pledged to do better. They were outraged. Police departments pledged to do better. There was just all of this outrage, this emotional reaction to George Floyd being murdered. But again, to piggyback on what Dr. King was saying, was that once that emotion dies down, nothing really changed. And that's exactly what happened in George Floyd's case. There's no real change. I mean, black men and women were shot and killed after George Floyd. Racism and discrimination continue in the hiring practices of the corporations in America. I mean, the status quo was maintained, and that's what Dr. King was saying. Once you get past that emotion and they talk, a good game, nothing really changes. This is what Dr. King was teaching us. That's the Dr. King that the media does not show. But Dr. King, again, like I said, was a wise man, was a mature man, and he understood that you continue to evolve and you continue to learn. And Dr. King continued to learn along this journey that he was on and called life. There are two other incidents or segments of his life that I want to talk about so that you can, I think, really understand how he evolved as a person and how we must evolve as well. Dr. King spoke out against the war in Vietnam. Now, again, for some young people who I hope will hear this, some of you may not be that familiar with the war in Vietnam, which took place in the 60s. But in the 60s, America sent troops across the water to Southeast Asia to war against the people in Vietnam. Dr. King said America had no business fighting the Vietnamese. Dr. King said it was an unjust war, and he spoke out boldly against America, once again using her imperialistic powers to wage war against a small, tiny nation in Southeast Asia for her own selfish interests. That's how Dr. King perceived it, and rightfully so. So Dr. King spoke out against the Vietnam War. He called, in one of his speeches in his opposition to the Vietnam War, he said that America was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. When America had been trying to give this impression that she was the peacekeeper and everybody else was waging war and violence, Dr. King said, no, 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 no. He said, America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Those are his words. So when Dr. King spoke out against the war in Vietnam, many Black folks and many Black leaders, preachers, other civil rights leaders, they told Dr. King literally to shut up. They told Dr. King, stop speaking out against the Vietnam War because you are making it bad for us, making it uncomfortable for us, because white folks were so opposed to Dr. King saying anything against America when he saw America doing what he knew was wrong and unjust. But Dr. King told the Black leaders, I am a citizen of the world. I can speak out against anything that I want to speak out against. You can't just tell me I can only speak out against civil rights in America. I can speak out against any subject matter that I want to talk on. And when I see wrong, when I see immorality, when I see things that are unjust, even if it's coming from our own country, I have the right and really the obligation to speak out against it. So Dr. King said, no, you're not going to silence me. The Vietnam War is wrong. America has no business overseas in Asia killing those the Vietnamese people. And he said it was wrong. Well, the civil rights leaders were upset because they were worried that Dr. King was going to hurt them and probably cause them maybe to lose some grants or some money somehow. And they thought he was out of line, that he was upsetting the white power structure, and he did. President Lyndon Johnson, who was president at that time, President Johnson, who was supposed to be or gave the impression that he was somehow a friend of the Black community and a friend of the civil rights movement, actually disinvited Dr. King from the White House because he was so, and pardon my language, but he was so pissed with Dr. King because Dr. King had the nerve to speak out against the Vietnam War. And President Johnson, as president, was actually waging this war against the Vietnamese, and the nerve of Dr. King to be able to stand up and speak out against the war. So he disinvited Dr. King from the White House. He told other civil rights leaders, you need to talk to Dr. King, you need to get him in line. And Dr. King was having none of that. He was going to stand on principle and that which he knew was correct. He became he was labeled, not just me saying this, he was labeled as the most hated man in America. White folks were actually calling for his death. They said that he was a traitor because he spoke out against the war in Vietnam. And you don't hear about this part of the history of Dr. King in his life. He faced all kinds of death threats, not just the death threats that he received later when he was assassinated later on, which we'll talk about in a second, but he was receiving death threats in 1966, 1967, because he was speaking out against the war in Vietnam. J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI, had long hated Dr. King, had hated him for years. He had spied on Dr. King, using the FBI to spy on Dr. King. They had infiltrated the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is the organization that Dr. King headed up. The FBI had infiltrated not just Dr. King's organization, but pretty much all of the civil rights organizations. J. Edgar Hoover had what he thought was some damaging personal information on Dr. King, and he told Dr. King that I have some damaging information on you and personal information that I'm going to release to the public. And if you don't want it released to the public, the best thing you can do is to commit suicide. So the head of the FBI tried to persuade, if you will, for lack of a better word, Dr. King to actually commit suicide. And this is all documented. I'm not speaking anything what I think. I'm telling you what I know. So J. Edgar Hoover told Dr. King to commit suicide, which of course we know that didn't go too well because Dr. King didn't commit suicide. But he was the most hated man in America. The government hated him. Many of the black preachers and black civil rights leaders turned their back on him. And Dr. King, in many ways, was walking alone during that time, 67, 66, 67, and on into 68 for that matter. But that part of the history of his life is not discussed. But we need to understand that, because we need to understand how Dr. King continued to evolve. We need to understand that his true legacy is the legacy of a man who was not afraid to evolve, who was not afraid to take on issues, whether they were popular or not, because he stood up for what he believed to be right, to be true and correct. And we need to learn the lessons that we have to be able to do, or have to be willing to do the same thing, that we're not going to run cowardly when the pressure comes, because Dr. King did not, that we're going to stand up as men and women, because Dr. King said a man cannot ride your back if you're standing up. So stop bending over, stand up straight, bold like a man. The man can't ride your back. So Dr. King continued to evolve, and he just became bolder and bolder, if you will, if that's possible, because he was already a bold and strong man. But I want the true legacy of Dr. King to be known to our children, because this is our history. And there are so many lessons to be learned from it. It teaches us what we're capable of, and it says that we're not going to allow someone else to distort the legacy of our heroes, if you want to use that word as well, okay? So Dr. King came out of the March on Washington being exalted for his I Have a Dream speech, but soon realized in a couple of years later that no, the I Have a Dream has really become a nightmare. He stood up against the Vietnam War and endured death threats. He endured his own people turning on him because he took these stances that he did. And then we come into 1968. It's April of 1968, or let's say even to back up into March and maybe even February. I'm not sure exactly when the strike started, but for those who know something about the history of Dr. King, there was a strike taking place in Memphis, Tennessee, among the garbage workers. And this is in 1968, early 1968. And Dr. King, I believe he had already gone to Memphis before, but he decided that he was going to go back to Memphis at around the 1st of April to show support to the garbage workers who were on strike. Well, when Dr. King made it known that he was going to Memphis, the death threats increased, and Dr. King received a lot of death threats, credible death threats, if you will, and his people around him, some of the lieutenants in his organization and others around him, basically were telling him not to go because of these death threats, that they really thought there was a good possibility that if he went to Memphis, Tennessee in April of 68, that he would be assassinated. Well, Dr. King, understanding these threats on his life and understanding that those threats were very credible, made a conscious decision to go anyway. He wanted to go and show his support for the garbage workers. And, you know, when that's how, as Christians like to quote when they talk about the least of these, well, Dr. King was showing his support for the least of these because, you know, in 1968, Black men who were garbage workers weren't receiving a lot of respect, right? So Dr. King said, no, I'm going to support the garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And so if there are threats on my life, then I'll have to deal with those threats. So when Dr. King got to Memphis, Tennessee, the night before he was assassinated, Dr. King spoke at a church in Memphis, Tennessee, and the church was packed. And if you, again, going on YouTube, you can find video footage of Dr. King speaking at this church the night before he was assassinated. This is the speech where you may have heard it referred to as the Mountaintop speech, where Dr. King said, I've been to the mountaintop. That speech, in many ways, could easily be characterized as his most powerful and most important speech, in my opinion. And I have not heard every speech that he gave, but it is definitely right up there with the most powerful speeches that he ever delivered. And here's why it was so powerful. And I would encourage you to go and listen to the entire speech, not just an excerpt where he talks about, I've been to the mountaintop, but listen to the entire speech. That speech was so powerful because here's what Dr. King said. He's in this church talking to this packed audience of Black folks in Memphis, Tennessee. And he's telling them, he's talking to them about economic, excuse me, he's talking to them about economic empowerment. That's really, I guess, one way to characterize it. He's talking to Black folks, not just in Memphis, but a speech that would go out around the world for that matter. And he's talking to them about economic empowerment. So Dr. King said to the Black people there that night, listen, they like to characterize, you know, let me put it this way. Dr. King said, individually, we may not be as rich as white people in America, individually. Dr. King said, but collectively, together, when we pool our dollars or you count our dollars together, we are I think he said it was either the 10th or 12th richest nation in the world when you pool our money together. So Dr. King said, so one of the things that we have to do is we've got to pool our resources, our financial resources together, because yes, individually, we may not be rich, but collectively, we are very wealthy. So Dr. King said, here's what we need to do. When you have white-owned corporations that are not treating us fairly, Dr. King said we must boycott those companies. He didn't say march. He said boycott them. Don't spend your money with white-owned corporations that are not treating you fairly. And this is 1968 when Dr. King is giving this speech. So Dr. King called out some of the names of some of the biggest corporations in America at that time that were not treating Black people fairly. So Dr. King said, Coca-Cola, boycott them. Why? Because of the way that they're treating Black folks. He said Wonder Bread, which is one of the largest bread companies at that time, he said boycott them. He's calling them out boldly. He said Seal Test Milk, which was one of the largest companies, milk producing companies in the world, I guess, at that time. They may still be around. We know Coca-Cola is, and I think Wonder Bread may be, I'm not sure. But Dr. King said boycott them, hit them in their pocketbook, make them hurt financially, economically. This is what Dr. King said in 1968 at the speech, that I Have a Mountaintop speech. But all we hear in the general public is the excerpt about, I've been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that we as a people will get to the promised land. Well, there's some real significant meaning in what Dr. King was saying there as well, but it's never really been properly interpreted. But the real problem is that they never show you the full speech where Dr. King was calling for economic boycotts, which is one of the most powerful ways. If you're going to protest by hitting people in their pocketbook. What's interesting is that you have many people after Dr. King were assassinated. You have other civil rights leaders that came into notoriety, if you will, who claim to have been students of Dr. King. Some claim to, say that they walked with Dr. King during his time. But you don't hear any of them calling for economic boycott. So how is it that you are a student of Dr. King, and Dr. King, in his last speech, was a huge proponent of economic boycotts, but none of these so-called leaders of then and today are calling for economic boycotts, but they're quick to say that they are students of Dr. King, okay? But Dr. King not only said boycott those companies that are not treating you right, the other thing that Dr. King said was put your money, spend your money with Black-owned businesses. Spend your money with Black-owned businesses. Dr. King said that's what we do at the organization that I head up, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. He said our money is in a Black bank. Our insurance is with a Black-owned insurance company. And he was telling the Black folks there, and again, like I said, not just the Black folks in that church, but Black folks, period, spend your money with Black-owned businesses. So Dr. King was probably what they would have called revolutionary in some people's minds, because this was not the man saying one day everybody just gonna walk hand in hand, Black boys and white girls and that kind of stuff. Dr. King said that was a nightmare. Let's deal with the reality. The reality is that when white-owned corporations don't treat you fairly, boycott them, hit them in their pocketbook, make them hurt the same way that we are hurting. And he said, take your dollars and put it in Black-owned businesses. And then he gave examples, and to let the people know that I'm not just telling you this, we're doing this. And if we were to do these things, we would find ourselves being economically empowered. So I just want to share this information with you because I have been so bothered for so many years of how we have allowed Dr. King's legacy to be distorted, the work that he did on our behalf to be misrepresented. And why is that so important? Again, as I said before, this is our history. This is our legacy. These are our leaders. They belong to us. They worked for us. And the last thing I want to say on this is that the next day, Dr. King was shot. And some would say he was shot and killed. Well, I say that, yes, he was shot and killed, but Dr. King actually laid down his life for us. People who are committed to the cause, they are willing to lay down their life for the cause. This is what Dr. King did. This is why he deserves to be honored in the highest form of honoring anyone that we can honor. Because Dr. King laid down his life. They would like to think that, oh, they killed him. And of course, when you kill him, the idea is to silence him, saying, let's bring this home. The idea is to silence. When you kill our leaders, the hope and the idea or the goal is to silence our leaders. That's why oftentimes, leaders are, before they are physically killed, there's an attempt to assassinate their character. And if you can't assassinate their character, then you kill them, or you try and do both, or then you physically kill them. But Dr. King laid down his life. He knew that if he went into Memphis, Tennessee, the death threats were real and very credible. You can see the night that he spoke. That's why I said I want you to not just hear the speech, but I want you to see the speech that he gave the night before in the church in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King had already transcended, really. He was at a level where he knew, I'm giving y'all the last speech. That's why I'm telling you that we as a people will get to the promised land. That's why he said, I may not get there with you, because I know these devils are going to take out my physical body tomorrow, but don't worry about it, because they can't kill me. They can kill the body, but they can't kill me. And we are still going to get back to the pinnacle of who we once were, the greatest people on the earth. We're going to get back there. We're going to get to the promised land. And Dr. King was not talking about heaven, life after death. He was talking about the fact that we had to do for ourselves right here. That's why in that same speech, Dr. King said, it is okay to talk about going to heaven. It's okay to talk about the land of the milk and honey. Dr. King said, that's fine if you want to talk about that. And he said, but when the people are down here now, they need shoes on their feet. They need shoes on their feet now. When they are hungry and they're not clothed, they need food and shelter and clothing now. They can't, just telling them about the great by and by. When the people are suffering, they need relief right now. So Dr. King was the man who had evolved, and he had evolved, and he had been willing I believe, from the time that he took up the work that he took up, that he was willing to lay down his life for his people. Our responsibility, and this now, once again, this is a divine obligation and responsibility that we have. And that is to honor him and to tell the truth about his work. Dr. King laid down his life because he knew that they could only kill the body. They could not kill him, but the only way that they could not kill him was that those who loved him and respected him would not let his memory die. We would not only would we not let his memory die, we would not allow them to distort his legacy. Because remember, like I said before, when you kill our leaders, the idea is to kill their voice. And when you kill our leaders, and then you relegate Dr. King to this one speech, I have a dream, so that you give a distorted image of who he was, a man who kept evolving, then you have literally killed his voice. And when we stand by and watch that happen and actually celebrate it by continuing to embrace the I have a dream speech ourselves as if he did nothing else for the next 5 years, then we are guilty of helping the enemies of our progress to retard our growth and our progress as a people. So we have a divine obligation to teach the truth about Dr. King, so that his work was not in vain, so that his laying down his life was not in vain, but was empowering to us as a people, that we will teach this truth about him to our children, so that our children will understand Black men and women throughout the ages have given their lives for the forward movement of our people. And that because you're going to have some of your children who want to work to change the condition or to improve the condition of life for our people. And we need to let them know that that is noble honorable work, that they do not have to fear, and that they do not have to worry about what others say and think about them, but simply do what they believe is right and correct. And so we honor Dr. King. We thank him. We say to those who continue to distort his legacy, cut it out. And whether you cut it out or not, we're going to set the record straight. So I encourage all of you, go back and continue to study Dr. King. Go and listen to those speeches he gave after 1963, why he opposed the Vietnam War, his full and complete speech that he gave the night before his assassination, I've been to the Mountaintop speech, and some others as well. Okay, so that we can honor him, so that the King holiday doesn't become just a day off from work, that a day to party, a day to get drunk, but that we really can pass on to our children the truth about who this great man was, and then build on that by teaching them about all of the other great men and women as well. So we salute you, Dr. King. We honor you. We thank you for the work that you did on our behalf. And we make a commitment that we're not going to allow your memory to die. We're not going to allow your legacy to be distorted. And we will work as well to help move our people forward in with the same commitment and the relentlessness that you had. He was relentless in his desire to see us move forward. We want to bring that same energy and commitment as well. So I thank you all for listening. And I hope that this message, my words, do not fall on deaf ears, but that they will make a positive difference in your life and in the lives of those even yet to come. Peace and blessings to you all.